Hello there, fellow wanderers through the corridors of time. Tonight, we're going to journey into one of humanity's most disturbing and fascinating attempts to cheat death itself. A process so gruesome and complex that it would make modern medical professionals shudder in horror. So please, settle yourself comfortably wherever you are tonight. Perhaps dim the lights and pull your blanket a little closer. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in London as fog rolls through the streets? Perhaps from a quiet apartment in Montreal as snow begins to fall? Maybe you're in a small town in Australia, watching the sun rise over peaceful suburbs? Wherever you are, you're about to discover that behind the golden masks and treasures of ancient Egyptian tombs lies a story of bodily violation, chemical torture, and preservation techniques so brutal that they would be considered crimes against humanity by modern standards. If this exploration into humanity's most disturbing death rituals helps you appreciate the peaceful dignity of modern funeral practices, perhaps consider subscribing for more journeys through history's darkest chapters. And don't forget to like this video if it helps you drift into peaceful sleep. Think death is scary? Think modern medical procedures are uncomfortable? Imagine lying helpless while practitioners use bronze hooks to scramble your brain and pull it out through your nose in bloody chunks. Imagine having your organs methodically removed through a small incision while you're fully conscious, then watching as your hollowed-out body cavity is packed with salt and toxic chemicals that burn your remaining flesh from the inside out. Imagine spending 70 days having your body systematically destroyed and rebuilt into something that barely resembles human form, all in the desperate hope that this mutilation might somehow preserve your soul for eternity. This is the horrifying reality behind Egyptian mummification. A process so traumatic and degrading that it transformed death from a natural transition into a prolonged nightmare of bodily violation and chemical torture that often failed spectacularly, leaving families with nothing but putrefied remains wrapped in expensive linen. Picture, if you will, ancient Egypt at the height of its power around 1550 BCE, when the New Kingdom pharaohs ruled an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. This was a civilization that had mastered architecture, mathematics, medicine, and art to degrees that wouldn't be matched for millennia. Egyptian engineers built pyramids with precision that challenges modern construction techniques. Egyptian doctors performed surgeries that saved lives and healed injuries with remarkable success rates. Egyptian artists created works of beauty that still inspire wonder 4,000 years later. But beneath this veneer of sophistication lay an obsession with death and preservation that drove the Egyptians to develop the most elaborate and disturbing burial practices in human history. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transition to an eternal afterlife, where the deceased would need their physical body to house their soul. This belief, combined with Egypt's hot, dry climate that naturally preserved some bodies, led to an entire industry devoted to preventing decomposition through artificial means that were often more destructive than the natural decay they were meant to prevent. The mummification process that has captured popular imagination for centuries was actually a luxury service available only to the wealthy elite. But even the most expensive procedures involved techniques that would horrify modern medical professionals. The process took approximately 70 days to complete and required specialists who had spent years learning techniques that were part medical knowledge, part religious ritual, and part horrifying bodily mutilation designed to transform human remains into something that could theoretically last for eternity. The first step in the mummification process was the most traumatic and degrading: the complete removal of the deceased person's brain through their nasal cavity. The embalmers used long bronze hooks, some as long as a person's arm, which they inserted through the nostril and pushed deep into the skull until they could feel the resistance of brain tissue. They then moved the hook in circular motions, literally scrambling the brain into a liquid consistency that could be drained out through the nose. But the brain removal process rarely went smoothly. The delicate bones that separate the nasal cavity from the brain cavity frequently broke during the procedure, sending bone fragments into the brain tissue and making extraction even more difficult and messy. Embalmers often had to use multiple hooks simultaneously, sometimes working for hours to remove all traces of brain matter. The bronze hooks would scrape against the inside of the skull, creating a sound that witnesses described as similar to stirring thick porridge, while blood and brain fluid poured from the deceased's nose and mouth. When the hook method failed to remove all brain tissue, embalmers resorted to even more disturbing techniques. They would turn the body upside down and shake it vigorously, hoping that gravity would help drain the liquefied brain. Sometimes they poured heated oils or acids into the skull cavity to dissolve remaining tissue, then drained the resulting mixture through the nose. These chemicals often damaged the skull bones, causing the face to collapse or become grotesquely distorted during the preservation process. The brain removal process was made even more horrifying by the fact that it was often performed on people who were not completely dead. In ancient Egypt, the line between life and death was not as clear as modern medical science has made it. People who appeared dead due to illness, injury, or coma were sometimes subjected to mummification while they were still alive but unconscious. Archaeological evidence suggests that some mummies show signs of struggling or moving during the brain removal process, indicating that the procedure was performed on living victims who may have regained consciousness during the ordeal. After the traumatic brain removal, the embalmers moved on to the equally disturbing process of organ extraction, which required them to make a small incision in the left side of the abdomen and remove all internal organs except the heart. This incision, typically only about 4 inches long, was far too small for the work that needed to be done, forcing embalmers to tear and cut organs into pieces to extract them through the narrow opening. The organ removal process was extraordinarily difficult and often resulted in extensive damage to the body cavity. Embalmers had to reach deep into the abdomen and thoracic cavity, often working by feel rather than sight, to locate and remove organs that were connected by tissue, blood vessels, and other anatomical structures. They used crude bronze knives and hooks to cut organs free, frequently tearing blood vessels and causing internal bleeding that pooled in the body cavity and created ideal conditions for bacterial growth and putrefaction. The lungs presented particular challenges because they were protected by the rib cage and connected to the respiratory system through delicate tissues that were easily torn. Embalmers often had to break ribs or cut through chest muscles to reach the lungs, leaving the torso severely damaged and unstable. The liver, being the largest internal organ, required extensive cutting to remove through the small abdominal incision, often leaving behind fragments that would decompose and contaminate the entire body cavity. The intestines presented their own horrifying challenges. The small and large intestines, totaling nearly 30 feet in length when uncoiled, had to be carefully extracted without rupturing and spilling their contents into the body cavity. However, the crude tools and techniques available to ancient embalmers made it virtually impossible to remove the intestines intact. Tears and ruptures were common, releasing digestive enzymes and bacterial contents that accelerated decomposition rather than preventing it. The kidneys, nestled deep in the back of the abdomen, required embalmers to reach far into the body cavity, often damaging surrounding tissues and blood vessels in the process. The extraction process frequently left behind kidney fragments that became sources of infection and putrefaction. The bladder, if full at the time of death, could rupture during the extraction process, releasing urine into the body cavity and creating chemical conditions that promoted bacterial growth. The only organ that embalmers deliberately left in place was the heart, which the Egyptians believed was the center of intelligence and emotion. However, leaving the heart in place while removing all surrounding organs created its own problems. The heart, deprived of its support structure and blood supply, often shifted position within the chest cavity, sometimes becoming dislodged and falling into the abdomen where it could interfere with the preservation process. Once the organs were removed, they were supposed to be individually preserved and placed in special containers called canopic jars. However, the preservation of extracted organs was often even less successful than the preservation of the body itself. The organs were typically packed in natron salt, but without the complex circulatory and lymphatic systems that had once kept them healthy, they often decomposed into putrid masses long before the 70-day preservation period was complete. The liver, being rich in blood and enzymes, was particularly prone to rapid decomposition. Even when packed in salt, livers often turned into black, foul-smelling masses that had to be discarded entirely. The lungs, with their delicate air sacs and moist tissues, frequently collapsed and rotted despite preservation efforts. The stomach and intestines, already damaged during extraction, rarely survived the preservation process intact, often decomposing into unrecognizable masses of putrid tissue. After the traumatic organ removal, the embalmers began the process of dehydrating and preserving the remaining body, which involved packing the empty body cavity and covering the entire corpse with natron salt. Natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate, was supposed to draw moisture from the tissues and prevent bacterial growth. However, the reality of the natron treatment was far more brutal and often counterproductive than the idealized process described in ancient texts. The natron salt was highly caustic and could cause severe chemical burns to any remaining soft tissues. When packed into the empty body cavity, the salt came into direct contact with internal surfaces that had been torn and damaged during organ removal, causing chemical reactions that were essentially acid burns from the inside out. The salt drew moisture from the tissues so aggressively that it often caused the skin to crack and split, creating openings where bacteria could enter and begin decomposition processes despite the preservative treatment. The dehydration process was extremely uneven and unpredictable. Areas of the body that were in direct contact with large amounts of natron became overdried and brittle, sometimes mummifying into leather-like consistency that was prone to cracking and crumbling. Meanwhile, areas that were sheltered from direct salt contact, such as deep muscle tissues or areas where body fluids had pooled, often remained moist enough to support bacterial growth and putrefaction. The 70-day treatment period was based more on religious tradition than scientific understanding of preservation requirements. In many cases, 70 days was far too long, resulting in overpreservation that left the body brittle and fragile. In other cases, particularly for larger bodies or those that had significant bacterial contamination before treatment began, 70 days was insufficient to complete the dehydration process, leaving pockets of unpreserved tissue that would continue to decompose after the wrapping process was complete. The natron treatment created its own horrifying side effects that often made the preserved body look less human than the natural decomposition process would have produced. The salt treatment frequently caused the facial features to become distorted beyond recognition, with the nose collapsing, the lips shrinking away from the teeth, and the eye sockets becoming hollow caverns. The skin often turned dark brown or black and developed a texture like old leather that bore little resemblance to living human skin. The weight loss during natron treatment was extreme and shocking. A typical adult body would lose 30 to 40% of its original weight during the 70-day process, transforming what had once been a normal-sized human into something that looked more like a child's skeleton wrapped in dark leather. The dramatic shrinkage often caused the limbs to become twisted and contorted as tendons and ligaments contracted unequally, leaving the body in grotesque positions that were impossible to correct. After the natron treatment was complete, the embalmers faced the challenge of trying to restore some semblance of human appearance to what had become a dried, shrunken, and often grotesquely distorted corpse. This restoration process involved techniques that were more like special effects makeup than medical preservation, using artificial materials to replace the volume and appearance that had been lost during dehydration. The body cavity, now empty of organs and severely shrunken, was packed with a mixture of materials that might include sawdust, linen rags, mud, sand, or even animal dung. These packing materials were intended to restore the body's original shape, but they often created new problems. Sawdust could absorb moisture and swell, distorting the body's proportions. Mud and sand could become breeding grounds for insects and bacteria. Animal dung introduced pathogens that could cause continued decomposition even after the preservation process was supposedly complete. The face, which had often become unrecognizable during the natron treatment, required extensive reconstruction using artificial materials. Embalmers would stuff the cheeks with linen or other materials to restore facial volume, but this stuffing often shifted over time, creating lopsided or grotesque facial expressions. The eyes, which had typically collapsed into the skull during dehydration, were sometimes replaced with artificial eyes made from stone or pottery, but these prosthetics rarely matched the original eye color or size, creating an unsettling appearance. The skin, now dried and brittle, was treated with oils and resins intended to restore flexibility and appearance. However, these treatments often had the opposite effect, making the skin even more fragile and prone to cracking. The oils could also become rancid over time, creating foul odors that penetrated the wrapping materials. The resins, while providing some preservative benefits, often turned dark and sticky, giving the mummy an unnatural, almost insect-like appearance. The wrapping process that completed the mummification was perhaps the most complex and failure-prone aspect of the entire procedure. The wrapping was supposed to provide protection for the fragile preserved body, while also serving religious and decorative functions. However, the wrapping process often caused more damage than protection, as the brittle, over-dried body was subjected to handling and manipulation that it could barely withstand. The linen bandages used for wrapping were often of poor quality, made from recycled clothing or bed linens that had been used for other purposes before being repurposed for mummification. These recycled textiles could harbor bacteria, insects, and other contaminants that would continue to cause problems after the mummy was sealed in its tomb. The bandages were typically soaked in resins and oils that were supposed to provide additional preservation, but these treatments often made the wrappings heavy and inflexible, putting additional stress on the fragile body underneath. The wrapping process required extensive handling of the preserved body, turning it repeatedly and manipulating the limbs to position the bandages correctly. However, bodies that had undergone the brutal dehydration process were often so fragile that normal handling could cause limbs to break off or skin to crack and peel away. Embalmers frequently had to use additional binding materials to hold together bodies that were literally falling apart during the wrapping process. The positioning of the body during wrapping was also problematic. The traditional mummy position, with arms crossed over the chest and legs straight, often required forcing the preserved body into unnatural positions that could cause additional damage. Bodies that had become contorted during the dehydration process sometimes could not be straightened without breaking bones or tearing dried tissues. The final appearance of a completed mummy was often so far removed from the appearance of the living person that family members could not recognize their deceased relative. The combination of facial distortion from brain removal, body shrinkage from dehydration, skin discoloration from chemical treatment, and the bulk of the wrapping materials created something that looked more like an ancient artifact than a preserved human being. But the most disturbing aspect of Egyptian mummification was how frequently the entire process failed completely, leaving families with putrefied remains that were worse than what natural decomposition would have produced. The failure rate for mummification was extraordinarily high, particularly for bodies that were not perfectly fresh when the process began or for procedures that were performed by less skilled embalmers. Bacterial contamination was one of the most common causes of mummification failure. If bacteria had begun to establish themselves in the body before preservation began, or if they were introduced during the organ removal process, they could continue to multiply even in the presence of natron salt. The bacteria often produced gases that caused the preserved body to swell and eventually burst, creating spectacular and horrifying failures that left families with remains that were far worse than what simple burial would have produced. The crude tools and techniques used by ancient embalmers created numerous opportunities for contamination and failure. Bronze knives that were used to cut organs could transfer bacteria from one body to another if they were not properly cleaned between procedures. The recycled linen used for wrapping could harbor pathogens that would cause decomposition to resume after the mummy was sealed in its tomb. Even the natron salt itself could become contaminated if it was reused multiple times without proper purification. Weather conditions during the 70-day preservation period could also cause catastrophic failures. If the climate was too humid, the natron salt could not effectively dehydrate the body, leaving pockets of moisture where bacteria could thrive. If the temperature was too high, the preservation process could proceed too quickly, causing the body to become brittle and fragile before the treatment was complete. Sudden changes in weather could cause preserved bodies to crack or split as they expanded and contracted with temperature and humidity fluctuations. The quality of the natron salt itself was often problematic. Not all natron deposits contained the same mixture of chemicals, and some sources produced salt that was less effective at preservation or that contained impurities that could actually accelerate decomposition. Embalmers had little understanding of chemistry and often could not distinguish between high-quality and poor-quality preservation materials until after the process had failed. Even when the mummification process was technically successful in terms of preserving the body, the results were often so disturbing and unrecognizable that families wished they had chosen simpler burial methods. The psychological trauma of seeing a loved one transformed into a dark, shrunken, and grotesquely wrapped object was often worse than the grief of natural death and burial. The economic burden of mummification was crushing for many families, who often spent their entire life savings on preservation procedures that frequently failed or produced results that were worse than what free natural burial would have achieved. The mummification industry was notorious for charging enormous fees for procedures that had low success rates and for pressuring grieving families into purchasing additional services that were often unnecessary or counterproductive. The religious promises that supposedly justified the traumatic mummification process were themselves problematic and often contradictory. Different Egyptian religious traditions had varying beliefs about the afterlife and the role of the preserved body, but embalmers typically presented mummification as essential for spiritual salvation regardless of the deceased person's specific religious beliefs. Many families discovered too late that their particular religious traditions actually discouraged or condemned the bodily violations required for artificial preservation. The social pressure to choose mummification over simpler burial methods created a competitive atmosphere where families felt compelled to demonstrate their wealth and devotion by subjecting their deceased relatives to increasingly elaborate and expensive preservation procedures. This social pressure often led families to choose mummification options that were beyond their financial means or that were inappropriate for their specific circumstances. The storage and transport of mummies after the preservation process was complete created additional opportunities for damage and failure. Mummies were often transported long distances to reach their final burial sites, and the fragile, preserved bodies frequently suffered damage during transport that undid months of preservation work. The tombs where mummies were stored were often inadequately protected from moisture, temperature changes, and pests that could cause continued deterioration after burial. The grave robbing that plagued Egyptian burial sites often targeted mummified remains specifically because the preservation process was associated with valuable grave goods and precious materials. However, the tomb robbers typically had no interest in preserving the mummies themselves and often destroyed the preserved bodies while searching for valuables, making the entire traumatic preservation process pointless from a practical standpoint. Modern archaeological investigation of Egyptian mummies has revealed the full extent of the trauma and failure associated with ancient preservation techniques. CT scans and other advanced imaging technologies have shown that many mummies contain evidence of botched procedures, failed preservation attempts, and damage that occurred during the mummification process itself. Some mummies contain the wrong organs from other bodies, or artificial materials that were used to replace organs that decomposed during preservation. The chemical analysis of mummy tissues has revealed that many ancient preservation attempts actually accelerated decomposition rather than preventing it. The harsh chemicals used in the process often broke down tissues and created conditions that were more favorable to bacterial growth than natural burial would have been. Some mummies contain evidence of multiple preservation attempts, suggesting that families repeatedly tried to repair failed mummification procedures. The discovery of mummy bundles that contain only bones or completely decomposed remains has shown that the ancient Egyptians often wrapped and buried failed preservation attempts rather than admitting that the expensive procedures had not worked. These deceptive practices meant that families often never knew that their loved ones had not been successfully preserved until modern scientific investigation revealed the truth centuries later. The evidence from ancient Egyptian medical texts suggests that even contemporary observers were aware of the high failure rates and traumatic nature of mummification procedures. Some papyri contain warnings about the dangers of attempting preservation on bodies that are not perfectly fresh or on people who died from certain diseases. Other texts describe alternative preservation methods that were less traumatic but also less prestigious than full mummification. The psychological impact of the mummification industry on ancient Egyptian society was profound and largely negative. The obsession with artificial preservation created a culture of death anxiety where people spent enormous amounts of time and resources preparing for death rather than focusing on living. The traumatic nature of preservation procedures made death even more frightening and difficult for families to process in healthy ways. The religious justifications for mummification were often used to exploit grieving families who were vulnerable to pressure and manipulation. Embalmers and religious authorities frequently claimed that deceased relatives would suffer in the afterlife if they were not properly preserved, creating emotional blackmail that forced families to undergo procedures they could not afford and that often failed to achieve their stated purposes. The artisans and workers who performed mummification procedures often suffered from health problems related to their exposure to toxic preservation chemicals and decomposing human remains. Ancient texts describe lung diseases, skin conditions, and other health problems that were common among embalmers, suggesting that the mummification industry was dangerous even for the practitioners who supposedly knew how to handle the chemicals and techniques safely. The environmental impact of the mummification industry was also significant, requiring enormous quantities of natron salt, precious oils, linen textiles, and other materials that had to be extracted from natural environments or imported from distant locations. The production of mummification materials often involved exploitative labor practices and environmental destruction that affected entire regions of the ancient world. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, reflect on how the ancient Egyptians' terror of death led them to create preservation procedures that were often worse than the natural decay they were trying to prevent. Consider how their obsession with artificial immortality caused them to subject their deceased loved ones to trauma and violation that would be considered torture by modern standards. Think about how the promise of eternal preservation often resulted in spectacular failures that left families with putrefied remains wrapped in expensive linens. Let their story remind you that sometimes our attempts to cheat or control natural processes can lead to results that are far worse than what we were trying to avoid. The ancient Egyptians' quest for immortality through mummification shows us that elaborate technical solutions are not always better than simple, natural approaches, and that the fear of death can sometimes lead us to create horrors that are worse than death itself. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that your eventual death will be treated with dignity and respect rather than with the chemical torture and bodily violation that characterized ancient preservation procedures. Rest in the knowledge that modern funeral practices honor the memory of the deceased without subjecting their remains to traumatic procedures that often failed to achieve their stated goals. The mummies of ancient Egypt lie wrapped in their eternal darkness, silent witnesses to humanity's capacity to turn the natural process of death into a nightmare of technological horror that often achieved nothing but suffering for the living and desecration for the dead.